afternoon, everybody. Give me just a second. I'll get my screen up and running here, and we'll start talking. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see it.
We'll put it in presentation. So my name is Adam Cheatham. I'm Director of Strategy and Transformation at Third Stage Consulting Group. We're here to talk today about software selection and evaluation, right? So overall goal of this session is to talk a little bit about some of the things that can help you select software successfully and ways of thinking and approaching your software selection and evaluation. This type of methodology, of course, ERP also applies to all kinds of other different types of enterprise software systems. Things CRM, HCM, MES, all those different types of software packages. If you're looking to evaluate and select one, you can use this type. When we think about overall software in general, the way that I really like to approach this is first in thinking about from a digital strategy alignment perspective. It's really important that when we think about this, we're thinking holistically, and having a digital strategy to point you in the direction that you want to go is a really key component of the software selection cycle, if you will. One of the things that people tend to skip to is, of course, because we're talking about selecting software, is that these two bars in the center here, enterprise applications and solution architecture. Let's just find a software and plug it in. That's all we have to do, right? And that's not really the case, because when you start thinking about software selection, I always like to approach it more of a fashion of why are you selecting new software, right? Selecting and implementing ERP, for example, is a big task. It's a big job. It's a big project. It takes quite a long time, and a lot of people will put in a lot of effort to make that type of a project successful. So when you start thinking about why you might do something like this, why you might orient the resources of your organization towards an enterprise application deployment, you start to think about why. And generally, we got all kinds of good reasons for selecting and implementing software, and they all center around the idea that we need to be better at this. Our processes are broken here. We're looking to become more effective and efficient in these areas, or we've outgrown our systems to the point where we can no longer operate the way that we want to as we continue to grow and scale. All of these are indicative of process needs, right? And as you think about the answers to that, why are we implementing ERP or CRM or any type of software? Really, the answer gets down to because I have a business process need that isn't being currently met. So the way that we like to start thinking about it first then is about your business processes, right? Software should fit for those. And as you start to think about your business processes, you start with current state, and then you start to diagnose a future state on where you want to go. This is that conversation about I have broken processes today, and then I'm trying to get better for tomorrow by you creating the opportunity to use a new tool. So the process is really the root cause or the reason behind this enterprise application deployment. When you start thinking about improving your processes, then you should start thinking about the people that administer them. What are their thoughts? What are their pain points? And what is their readiness to adopt a new tool? Some organizations are ready for it. Some people in some organizations are ready for it, for sure. They see the value in what a new software package can bring. They are experiencing quite a lot of pain in their existing processes. So you have a contingency that is certainly into this idea of implementing a new software package. There are often also others who question the idea, like, why would we do something that's difficult? The software we have today works just fine. And, what would be the purpose in going through the effort of changing? When you start to consider the needs of your people in this conversation, you start to really go down the path of good, strong organizational change management. And when we think about organizational change management, we're really thinking about people enablement, right? How do we enable our people to adopt a new software package and accept that new software package as a part of their life? Because really, when you change software, you're really changing processes, and that's going to have a dramatic impact on your people. At third stage, we talk about old processes and new software just are expensive old processes, and getting the new processes designed and getting your people to administer them in a new system are two key components in making sure that once you're live on software, your adoption rates are high and you're fully enabling your teams to actually use that software to achieve those process goals that you have. Now, when you think about enterprise applications, you're starting to think about it as a tool, as a digital enabler of your people to administer the processes that they do day in and day out at a higher rate of effectiveness and efficiency. This is really the appropriate relationship between the business and technology, process, people, and technology. You start with process, you figure out what those are going to be, then you get your people oriented around what those processes are going to be and what their new tools are going to look like in the future, and then you find the right applications for accomplishing those goals. I spent a lot of time with a recent client talking about having the right tool for the right job, right? That's really what we're thinking about here. And having the right tool for the right job really means knowing what the job is first, and then devising a method of using a tool to accomplish that job with a team that is on board and enabled and trained to do so. From there, the solution architecture kind of becomes a conversation of, all right, now we know what our software is for enabling these process goals we need. Our people are ready. Now we got to figure out how to deploy this thing, and we got to get it onto some type of a platform, whether that's a cloud infrastructure or a software as a service or a hosted on premise. Those are all things that are a part of your architecture that are going to have an impact there. And you want to consider what the consequences of those types of decisions are, because it will have an impact on your architecture on the whole. How do you integrate systems that aren't going away? Because for the most part, when you implement an enterprise software system, you don't really replace everything with one system. That's pretty uncommon. It's more regular to have even at the ERP level a number of additional applications that want to integrate with the app, whether it's an EDI platform or a tax platform or an HCM payroll platform. All those things are common integrations that we need to consider. And as we start thinking about architecture and those integrations, we want to start orient our minds towards how do we accomplish this task of pulling out the old system or systems and not breaking the ones that will remain and need to be integrated with the new software system. So we want to make sure that we get that right. From there, once you get that real relationship between the process and technology in the right order, and you put it on a platform and create integrations that are strong and are and pass data appropriately, business intelligence and analytics become an effective window into your business. You start spending a lot less time digging through your data warehouse, trying to find the data that tells the story that you're trying to tell. Um, you hear the saying, you can use statistics to say anything. You can use data to say anything, and if you're a large enough organization, there's a good chance that the more digging you do for data, the more you can make it say what you think you want it to, and that's not really an accurate. Well, it's not always an accurate view into the actual health and functions of your business. When you get your process aligned appropriately in your software, knowing which process is up front and then finding the right software that enables it, business intelligence and analytics become an effective window into the health of your business, because they tell you more effectively what it is is actually happening out there without you having to dig through tables and tables and lines and lines and lines of data, writing all kinds of different types of SQL queries, running table joins and all that stuff to try to create a compelling story. The story is there because it's been created to do that. The last thing that is important about digital strategy in general is to think about it from a perspective of saying if these are the work streams that are necessary to consider when you are working through your software evaluation and selection. If you let all of these work streams go in the direction that they naturally go in by themselves, they will go in different directions. It takes an intent to keep these types of work streams aligned together in a complementary fashion. And that's where project quality assurance and the selection side of things comes together. I like to think of it more as project governance. How do I make sure that we are continuing to emphasize the right relationship between our processes and our technology, where our processes become the front end of the selection and the technology becomes the enabler of those processes? Another key part of how I like to think about software selection is as a part of implementation readiness, right? Um, Software selection projects are the type that are designed to create more work, right? I'm going to select a software system so then I can go and implement it, which is a much larger job for the organization. So as we think about implementing software in this real strong this very large project really that will have a strong impact on the organization on the whole, we start to think about implementation readiness. And at third stage, our overall selection methodology is a step-by-step program that is focused on, of course, selecting software effectively. Um, but I like to think of it as also a part of implementation readiness. Um, as you start to talk about implementing software, uh, you want to get some things right so that you're ready to implement when you sign a contract. It doesn't take long from the point that you sign a contract with the vendor and the system integrator for them to be ready to show up and get to work. Uh, when they show up and get to work, as I'm sure many of you are aware, they're ready to go and they start going. And if you're not ready for them, you spend a lot of time playing catch up and playing from behind. Um, our implementation readiness framework allows us to help our clients and organizations like your guys's to be ready for their implementation when they sign that contract. So this is kind of a view of some of that readiness methodology and some of the very key and important steps to becoming ready for an implementation itself. I've highlighted in green the functions of implementation readiness that are commonly addressed in software selection. Up front, you have strategic and executive alignment, where there are a number of opportunities for things like executive education. What are we doing? What is, for example, what is ERP, and what are we going to get out of it? Having executives understand what the goal purpose of this is a key important part of gaining their alignment and putting them in a position to be strong advocates for the implementation as well as strong contributors. Um, we'll talk about what we do in the selection cycle for executive alignment and things like that. But the overall goal is to think about strategy of what it is this software is supposed to do, and create a strategy for achieving that, starting with software selection. From a people perspective, like we talked about before, you got actually let's talk about operational readiness first. From a process perspective, like we talked about before, you want to start with processes at the front end of the conversation. What are we trying to accomplish when we are implementing new software from a process perspective? Really what we're looking for is operational improvement, right? So those we want to think about how ready our operations are, where are our processes in greatest need of improvement, and what does that look like? At third stage, we like to dive deeper into those strategic processes and get an understanding of the level of complexity as well as the level of criticality to the business of each process. Some processes that aren't quite so heavily involved in your competitive advantages in the marketplace and things like that. Um, you don't need to go into as much detail, because if they're not as important to the actual system selection and implementation, then we want to make sure that their functions are covered, but we don't want to spend too much time focusing on the things that aren't as high priority. Many organizations, for example, are looking to achieve manufacturing and procurement efficiencies through deployment of ERP. So we'll focus on those areas, especially for organizations that are more focused on those functional areas from a base operational need. Other organizations are looking for more business intelligence and more a greater view into the financial foundation of their organization. So we'll focus on finance at a deeper level there, and those will be the areas that really drive the selection. Then you have your validation of requirements, and you really want to look at operational gaps. Not only operational gaps that you have today at your organization, but as you start to think about software, what operational gaps there are in the software packages that you're considering. These days, you don't find a lot of software packages that are the perfect fit. The idea of zero customization is really a myth. There will be gaps in whatever software package you choose, but we want to make sure that we're thinking about it from a perspective of what gaps can we handle and what gaps can we not. So that's part of the operational readiness side of it, and then having a plan for accommodating those when we know what it is we're going to need to accomplish differently than with the new software itself. The people readiness side of it, from a people readiness assessment, we like to survey the organization and get a strong understanding from the people involved in the processes, especially the ones that are going to change the most significantly, so that we know about their readiness. That question of why are we doing this, and what is the purpose of this large project that will be rather difficult for many people. Asking those questions and understanding the answers to them are key components of making sure that we're ready for software selection itself and the implementation of it. As we move into technical readiness, you start thinking about where we are with things like data and things like architecture. And I'll talk about what our solution architecture assessment looks like in a moment. But the idea here is I always like to tell my clients, you don't want data to become your critical path in your implementation. That's a recipe for a disaster. Because what ends up happening if you do allow for that to happen is all the software gets built, that's all ready to go, and the system integrator says, we're ready to go live. And you say, well, no, we're not, because I've got 3 months more worth of data work before we can go live. So I got to continue to keep my data, get my data cleaned up, and then your system integrator waits and your software system waits. If you wait long enough, security patches deploy to your new software, updates deploy to your new software, and these are all things that need to be reconfigured in the software system. So your implementation kind of continues on, and the work continues on, and the endpoints continue to change and move. So you still have to maintain an ERP effectively in a test environment and keep it up to date in a test environment while you're trying to get your data in line. And that's not really what we want to have happen. So when we start thinking about data up front, we start asking those questions. What does our data look like? How clean is it? How ready is it to migrate into a new system? And how much data do we want in that new system?
Yeah, and Adam, speaking of kind of that vendor alignment or that integration when it comes to those relationships, I know you touched on that a little, but we have a question on LinkedIn, which I think is a really good one. So it's more of a comment, but I'm going to kind of turn it into a question. When it comes to the RFI or RFP procurement process in the context of the selection approach, do you need to do specific homework without suffering from analysis paralysis?
That's a great question, and I'll get into more detail about some more specific answers to that, but the answer really is there's a balance, right? You'll write requirements for your software selection, and those will go into your RFP. We're not talking field by field level requirements. We're talking requirements at the functional level. And you want to make sure that you're covering your critical functions, but at the same time, you don't want to spend too much time thinking about all the teeny tiny little things that you do once a year, right?
Hmm.
So if you're focused on the things that you're doing once a year that take 5 minutes, that's where you start to get into the analysis paralysis type of area. But you do want to make sure that you have coverage of, again, those critical and complex areas that are the most unique to your organization. So in the RFP itself, you'll want to represent that and make sure that your system integrator that you're considering is aligned with what it is you're trying to accomplish and understands your needs and your requirements at an appropriate level. When we start thinking about software development, the purpose of requirements is to create the opportunity to devise a specific solution. Um, it's really supposed to drive the creation of a software solution. At the selection level, it's different. We're actually saying, I have a need, and we're looking for somebody to provide us with a solution that exists. So here's my need. Show me what you have, so that we can test drive it, we can check it out, we can demo it, and see whether or not that's an appropriate fit for our day to day life. The actual solutions themselves will vary from vendor to vendor, and that's really what we're looking for. We're going shopping for software. So that's a really good question. I'll get into a little bit more specificity on it here, actually on the next slide itself. So the last thing I want to mention about implementation readiness as it pertains to software selection is a software selection is a really great opportunity to start thinking about your project's governance for your implementation. Um, during the software selection process, you'll have a number of folks that will be pulled into that. I like to have a core team of folks with each of my clients to represent a cross-functional look at what it is the business needs. And that way, when we're talking about improvements, we have folks upstream and downstream of each other who can collaboratively consider what it is the benefits of improvements will be. And then ERP and enterprise-wide software is really oriented towards creating a massive shift in your organization. And when you start to change things that dramatically, you start to create risk. And we want to talk about risk early and often so that we can start thinking about how it is we manage it. To continue on to answer some of those additional questions that around requirements and those types of things, we'll start thinking a little bit about the actual software selection and evaluation process. Um, on the whole, you have really three chunks of work that go into the software selection itself. You have, first and foremost, the current state side of things. And as you're kicking off your project and get all of your project management chops in place, your current state is to talk about what it is we're doing today and how it is we're doing that so that we can target the areas for improvement that we want to. A key component of that, of course, is the executive strategy side of things. When we're considering software as an enabler of the business, we want to make sure that we understand not only what the business does well from a competitive advantages in the marketplace perspective, but also the organizational and operational goals of the business at the executive level. If we're going to think about software as enabling where it is you want to go in the future, we want to start thinking about what that future looks like. What are those goals that we're trying to achieve that we can't today because we don't have the right software package, or that we need to be able to continue to achieve, so that when we remove the old software package and put in a new one, we're not losing functionality and we're not losing our ability to operate as a business as who we are. That second row of boxes there is all about devising a future state. What am I going to look like in software in the future? And this is where you start thinking about those future state requirements that support that RFI, RFP process. We want to think, to a certain extent, we want to think blue sky with this, right? What could be? What are all the great things that we can get out of software? Especially when we're thinking about ERP, there are some goals that you'll have, yes, but we're not thinking about just solving our problems for tomorrow. We're thinking about solving problems and anticipating problems and farther ahead into the future. So when we think future state, we want to start talking about how we want to look. What are our potential improvements, and what are the areas that we want to be able to do better? And just as much, what are the things that we'll still have to be able to do in the future that we do today? Part of your future state is inevitably bound up in your current state in one way or another. Most organizations, and at least none that I know of, have really used ERP implementations or any type of enterprise software as an opportunity to overhaul their value proposition to the customer. If you manufacture widgets today, you're going to continue to do that tomorrow. If you're a professional services company today, you're going to continue to be that tomorrow. So we want to think about making sure that we take our current state, we don't lose functionality, but we do gain some of those great opportunities for improvement in software itself. Solution architecture becomes that component of what goes away and what stays, and how do we make sure that our data is ready, right? I like to do a systems inventory of what systems are out there and what do they do. So when we start thinking about functions that are going to be pulled into the new system, we know where those functions are accomplished in the actual existing systems today, and what systems can go away and what systems can't, so that we can plan for the integrations that we're going to have to build in the future. A lot of times, those integrations can come with additional conversations around integration platforms as a service, for example. Um, NetSuite often integrates with Shopify through Celigo. So when we talk to a lot of clients who are heavy into Shopify and are going to end up selecting NetSuite, Celigo becomes a part of the conversation, or other connectors that are like Celigos that are integration platforms as a service. If you leave that thought out, you'll find out that you need that integration platform at one point or another, and you want to have it scoped into your selection so that you know that that's going to be a component of your cost and implementation. So when we're thinking about those software evaluations and that short list that we're going to come to for a couple of vendors to send our RFPs out and run demos with, we are thinking about the package holistically and what it is we're going to need to keep and what it is going to need to go away. That last row of boxes is all about the software itself. Now that we've talked about who we are today and who we want to be in the future and what that might look like, let's go. It's time to go shopping. Notice that the business process side of this is right up front, like we talked about in the slide before this. And now we're starting to talk about how we find the software that fits that best. It is really important to find the appropriate software for your business processes, and you can end up spending a lot of money. I've talked to a lot of organizations who come fresh off of an ERP implementation, and 5 years later, they want something different. I've got actually several clients in that position right now where they've been on their new ERP for less than 5 years, and they can't wait to get off it because they missed something in their selection. So when we start thinking about that relationship between processes and software, we want to make sure that we're looking far enough into the future into what it is you're going to need, but also closely enough at today to know what it is we can't break. But we'll go through an RFP and a demonstration process to, with the RFP, ask questions like, of course, is this a request for proposal, right? How much does it cost? What are our licensing fees? What are our system integration services costs? Those types of things. And what other costs come along with this? Program management, travel, customizations, integration platforms, all of those things we want to understand in an RFP. And one of the common questions that I get from some of our clients is, right, but so it's just an RFP for an ERP, right? What if the ERP itself doesn't meet some of our core requirements? Like, well, I expect the system integrators to come to the table with a full solution. If their ERP system or whatever enterprise system we're considering doesn't meet all of our requirements, I I do expect them to have an answer for how it is they will solve for that. So it's not uncommon, for example, for an ERP system to say, we can meet most of your requirements. There are a couple of key areas where you're going to need a third party. We work really well with these guys, and so we'd like to bring them to the table and use them to solve for your requirements. Field service organizations, for example, are this is very common. Not very many ERP systems out there handle field services very well. They just do operations. So there's a bolt on for things like dispatch. Um, and the management of truck rolls and things like that. The RFP is also intended to start thinking about that fit for requirements. How does your software and proposed solution fit this requirement? Is it out of the box? Is it configurable? Must it be customized? These are all the more customization answers you get, the more difficult of a solution you have on your hands. But at the end of the day, we want to be able to consider this within context. Um, Overall, what we're looking for is an answer to the question, can you do it? Yes or no. That's the purpose of the requirements within the RFP. And what that looks like becomes and the effectiveness of that, the daily fit, daily life type of use, comes from the demonstrations itself. So the demos give us that view of how well do you do it. And this is where when you get that level of requirements right, when you get that level of requirements right in the software evaluation process up front, future state requirement documentation, you give the vendors an opportunity to say, I see your needs, and this is how our software system does that. And when you have a good comparison there that's well scripted based on your requirements, that answer to how well can you fit our needs and our daily needs as an organization really starts to come out. So this creates a lot of different variables for how it is we compare software systems, and the selection kind of comes out of that itself, and comparing how well do you do it, can you do it, yes or no, how much does it cost, how long is it going to take, and all of those things. Those are areas that we use to create a recommendation for software selection.
Before we move on, Adam, I want to get to this great question from Mark on LinkedIn. So, how do you evaluate conflicting preferences for different software solutions in a way that doesn't come down to they who shout the loudest? So, for example, if you want, a finance solution wants one thing, but warehouse wants a completely different solution. How do you manage to that conversation?
There are two parts of that. The first part is having a good cross-functional team, that core team that I talked about that you could use for implementation as well, with involved in your system selection process and in the requirements gathering process. When finance and operations understand each other's needs upstream and downstream and each other's impacts on one another, they tend to be far more open to a system that fits for all, right? Um, it's not uncommon for us, for example, to find in our requirements workshops that we have clients who have these aha moments where they say, I didn't realize that what I do really causes you that many problems. That's a point of the process workshops where you're starting to identify pain points. And those types of moments are really important ones where somebody says, I mean, you're really only saving me 10 minutes a day. And they go, right, but that takes me 3 hours to do that. So, well, then forget it. Don't worry about that. We'll find another way of doing it in the new system. You have a collaborative conversation. The second part of making sure that you get that conversation right, to eliminate the just solving the needs of the people who shout the loudest, um, is having that strategic alignment up front. What are our priorities here? And at the executive level, what are we trying to accomplish? Then when you sit down and say, not negotiations, excuse me, finance and operations disagree on software package, and somebody has said, right, well, our purpose here is to really create operational efficiencies on the shop floor so that we can really dig into making sure that our production planning and our demand planning are well synced. um, that's not really a finance conversation. And if finance's solution is going to provide less of that dynamic nature between the master production schedule and the materials requirements planning, it enables you to use your strategy and your executive goals as that lens for how do we compare these packages and how do we select the one that best fits our needs. So hopefully that's a good response for you on that. I'd love to know what you think about this when you start thinking about executives that have bias too. I'm curious how many
Mm.
of you guys have seen that, because sometimes we have executives that say, well, this is the software solution that I want, and that's what I'm going to stick with. And sometimes they're in the driver's seat and they're the sponsor. Other times they're an outside influencer on the steering committee, and those type of biases are things that we commonly confront, and commonly help our clients to see their way through. So it's a really good question. As we continue on, I have the remainder of these slides are detail around the rest of the selection process in each of these boxes themselves. So the current state assessment, when we talk about that question of how do you get the right level of requirements, you start with that in the current state assessment itself and start thinking about what are your functional area breakdowns, what does your software system today look like, what do your processes today look like, and what are our potential for improvements. This is where you start answering that question of why are we doing this, and that's for that second box there. We're doing this to improve our processes and to get more effective and more efficient, and we understand that the purpose of software here isn't to change software, it's to change processes. And that's something that will be an ongoing change, because the idea is to not only just enable one change for today and one massive shift, it's also to enable continuous improvement for the ability to grow within our processes and continue to achieve additional efficiencies. Again, as part of this current state assessment, we start thinking about data systems and infrastructure to talk through how it is we're going to pull apart our software system and plug more things back in. It's not uncommon to have gaps in your software itself from a functional area perspective. That's why we have process problems, right? Because our software isn't fitting our needs today. But it's also not uncommon to have redundancies. Just this week, actually, I was talking to an organization that say, well, some people use this system for that, and other people use that system for this process, and it all ends up at the same place. So that's all fine, right? So, well, just because it ends up at the same place doesn't mean that the journey to get there can't be the same, or shouldn't be. Because at the end of the day, well, if one person's using a different system to get there than another, you're really starting to create divergencies in your processes that cause inconsistencies in data. And frankly, using two systems for anything is that can be solved by one system is inefficient in and of itself. As we continue through the software selection process, you want to use those requirements to refine a long list first, and then dig down into a short list and narrow that down. Like I said, the long list starts to create an evaluation of software packages that could fit your requirements needs from a very, very high level. We think about software packages that are strong within a particular industry, software packages that have the and system integrators and the like that have the geographic coverage for being able to solve for deploying software, right? If you're just if you operate one location that runs warehousing, manufacturing, finance, headquarters all in one spot, that's a simpler look than if you have multiple different headquarters in different countries across the world. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about how it is you handle some of those key requirements at a high level that are specific indicators of how a software system needs to be large enough or small enough to handle your needs dynamically. We work with a long list first, and then start really considering the greater detail behind the requirements, and then we use that to narrow down to a short list. I like a short list of 2, maybe 3. Um, Having more than three for though is it really starts to continue down that path of potential analysis paralysis. By the time you get through the evaluation of your fourth software system, you've forgotten the first one. And everybody's brain turns to mush when you start thinking about demonstrating four different software packages. So we want to have a smaller short list that gives us a chance to really narrow in on a couple, maybe a third software packages that really can tackle the most unique and critical needs of your organization. That should be based at the requirement level, and how it is those types of organizations can meet your requirements. So when you start sending out RFPs, you're not surprised by somebody who says, "Yeah, I can't do most of that stuff." Doing your research and getting your short list right means that when you really get down to the RFP level and compare requirements, responses from one vendor to the second, and potentially a third, you get a really good one to one analysis of where the key gaps are. Again, in today's software environment, there are gaps in all software systems. I don't care how big a box software you're talking about. No software package does everything, especially everything that most organizations need. There's always a uniqueness that needs to be considered. And what we want to do is, with our shortlist, is create an opportunity for our requirements to really show and illuminate those differences as they pertain to those key critical functions of your business. And if we haven't considered the right requirements to get down to that short list, we'll find areas that aren't critical, or that aren't unique areas. They might be important, but they're not unique areas to your business. That there are gaps, and those gaps become kind of failure points as opposed to evaluation points. As I was saying, though, from a long list perspective and narrowing down to a short list, we really start to think about what are the key differentiators in your unique requirements, and what are the verticals within software that can solve for that. Certain software packages are better than others for things like um, process manufacturing versus street manufacturing, right? Those are very different manufacturing processes, and there's certainly specific targets of different software systems. Another good example of unique requirements and vertical focuses are, how complex are your manufacturing operations? You know, are you out there manufacturing airplanes? And airplane engines with a high degree of scientific perfection? Or are you an injection molding company that's certainly has different unique requirements, but the complexity of the bills of materials is very different between those two? And thinking about it from a perspective of what verticals are solved from an industry perspective, and how it is a certain software packages fit those ones or others, is really a key component of how it is you take a long list and start narrowing down to a short list. That would go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have a question that I think fits right into what you're talking about here. So,
Mhm.
what is the indicators that you're looking at a full-on ERP suite solution versus a best of breed solution, and where does that fit, or where do you find that out in the software evaluation process?
That's actually a really good question, and the answer really is, I can actually answer that. I keep hitting my mouse. Sorry about that. Um, I can really answer that question for you right now. To a certain extent, you're going to end up in a best of breed scenario. It is exceedingly uncommon to replace every single software that you have today with one. So you got to think about integrations to a certain extent. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody ends up with a different ERP, CRM, HCM, MES, and advanced warehousing packages all bolted together from different organizations. When you think about best of breed, you want to think about what your requirements are, and and what your areas of greatest need are, and where you're the most sophisticated. The way I like to consider it is, first, let's look at what we can get out of ERP. And then let's look at our areas that are our functional areas that are the most sophisticated and complex. And let's find out whether or not those are going to drive the need for more advanced software or more specifically catered software? Are you in an industry that requires a specific type of solution? A lot of distribution organizations, for example, that are focused on drop shipping and things like that, can be rather sophisticated with things like voice picking and all kinds of pick towers and different types of ways of managing their warehouse. And in those scenarios, we may find, and we often do, that while the core ERP itself serves most of the needs, there's an advanced need in that warehousing area that leads us to say you have more to consider here. You might think about an advanced warehousing solution as well. Part of that comes out when you write all of your requirements and start looking at what functional areas have the strongest fit for which software, and in what areas are significant gaps. Um, so that's one way of approaching it. Other ways of approaching it are kind of based on what type of a business are you? What types of verticals are you involved in? And what types of complexities are within your business? If you have, for example, a series of very different um, business units, for example, let's say, what's a good example? I have a client who has two different types of products. One of them is they do manufacturing, and they do manufacturing for a specific type of equipment. They also have a services line for installing that equipment and setting it up and all of those types of things. The needs of those two types of business lines are very different. So you may consider that one of those is going to get an ERP that handles the manufacturing, and then we're going to tackle the professional services side of it with a bolt-on, with a best of breed application. So that's another example of what that looks like. So the diversity of your business lines and product lines is a part of that. The complexity of your organization, specifically as it pertains to individual functional areas, will drive some of that. But at the same time, some of your general operations will dictate at least a little bit of best of breed solution on the whole. Most ERP packages won't do EDI by themselves, for example. You end up with a bolt-on for that. Most ERP packages won't do sales tax either. You end up with a bolt-on for that. Payroll, another good thing that always ends up outside of core ERP. These are all bolt-ons, common bolt-ons, but that does create a best of breed environment that the extent of how complex your best of breed environment is and what needs are met by it, driven through the requirements. But I think a key part of that is really that when we put out RFPs and RFIs, we send all of the requirements. We don't say, well, I think we're probably going to end up with a best of breed solution because for warehousing, or for an MES bolt-on. So we're going to leave those requirements out of this. Let's not make that assumption, because when you think about those requirements, we want to start thinking about how it is we look at the consolidated solution. The vendor may tell you that they can meet all of those requirements out of the box within their ERP, and you might be pleasantly surprised by that. On the flip side, they may also come to the table and say, yeah, you know what? Those are pretty special and unique requirements. And we do have a great partner that we have a strong integration with. They might not be the software that you would select independently if you selected one software system based on about your best of breed needs for a certain functional area, but that the strength of an integration can really go a long way for saying our ERP integrates really well with this advanced warehousing system. Others are maybe more challenging. So when we think about how it is that integration comes together, we want to consider that. I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm gonna keep going, but feel free to continue asking questions. Overall, when we think about narrowing in on an individual software, we have a lot of different types of ways of looking at this, and we start to think about how it is we engage with vendors. A couple of things that are key to this is, first and foremost, you want to have really strong demonstration scripts. That's the most important part of the demo process, is having demonstration scripts that represent your day-to-day needs clearly in a scenario-based fashion. Then that way you're asking the vendors to show me how you solve for my day-to-day needs. And yeah, sure, we'd love to see your bells and whistles and all the wonderful things that you love to sell, but I still need to know where you work and where you don't, so that I can use those both as key components of the evaluation itself. We do like on-site demonstrations because there's a lot that's to be gained from seeing it, but remote demonstrations can be effective as well. As you engage with your vendor through demonstrations and RFPs, you want to start to consider that scripting as a key component of it, and making sure that that's tightly oriented towards your project needs. The purpose of a software selection at the end of the day is to create a variety of variables that tell us which software systems are best fits for your organization or another. Proposal analysis, demonstrations analysis, and things like that, really a key component of it. With the proposal analysis, asking can you do it, yes or no? Then demonstration analysis, how well do you do it? We always recommend business case analysis. I like a total cost of ownership over 5 years that considers what are the license fees up front, what are the continuing and ongoing license fees, and what are the costs of implementation services. Those are 3 key components of that. But you may also consider what are the costs of integrations, what are the costs of anything else that is going to be necessary to support this, what are your project management needs from a PMO perspective. And then just as much, it's also important to think about what are the costs that are going away too, because you want to make sure that you measure that. I also like to think about reference calls and visits for software selection in the lens of not asking your vendor to provide a reference that says, hey, your software works, because they're going to find somebody, right? That's every software package works for somebody somewhere. What we're looking for in reference calls and visits is, how did that vendor handle your challenges in implementation? When you really got to that point where finance is screaming the loudest about what they think they need, how did in operations, which was a higher priority, really is getting steamrolled. How did your system integrator help you through that in your implementation? Those are the types of questions that I think are more helpful in understanding what it is we're getting into. So, on the whole, once you know who you're going to select, you want to think about having negotiations with them that creates a really strong long-term relationship, right? Now, you do want to make sure that you have a clear negotiating strategy on what's important to you from a cost perspective, and where it is you want to target your negotiations efforts. And you want to be clear on where you can be flexible and where you can't. Overall, you also want to think about how many users you have today and some of these other things that are on this slide. I think that the most important component of this is going to be a negotiation for implementation services, and relationship management is a key component of this conversation. Not everybody realizes that when your system integrator says, here is your scope of work and here's our master services agreement, those are negotiable. We're not talking just about negotiating software prices. We're talking about negotiating terms and conditions and things like that. In our expert witness program, we find that failures in negotiations on terms and conditions and creating clarity within the statements of work can really be a key component of how it is you draw up your implementation and what the support for that looks like on your side and the vendor side. And in a lot of our expert witness cases, we find that the ones that didn't consider negotiating their project plan, for example, are the ones that struggled the most with their implementation as it pertains to trying to figure out how it is that moves along. Here are a couple of additional key thoughts on best practice, right? So I'll highlight a couple of these right there in the middle. Nothing can please anybody. Address your needs, but understand that there is going to be a degree of business change, right? That's the purpose here. We're not looking to take our old processes and codify them in an expensive new system. We might as well keep our green screen if that's what we're going to do. The other one is that your processes are going to change. That's the purpose, and let's own that. Let's lean into it and understand that that's what we want to do. So, I really do appreciate you guys' time today. We're really excited to be to have all of you here with us. These conferences that we run are a ton of fun for us. We like putting them together. We like putting them on. We like sharing our knowledge with everybody. We really appreciate your participation here, as well as your questions and your comments. Thanks for joining us today. Hopefully hear from you at some point on how it is we can help you solve some of your selection and implementation challenges. I do see here real quick before I jump, as a nonprofit organization, one of the challenges of our digital transformation journey is not finding best breed applications that fit a good extent of the core needs. That's actually nonprofit organizations are really a lot like field service organizations, in that there's a core function in the middle of there from an ERP perspective, but there are other outside needs that aren't commonly handled well. Things like project accounting, when you're thinking about donations and government grants and having to be able to report back on what it is, where it is every dollar went, because some dollars are allowed to be spent, or some euros, or whatever currency you use, is allowed to be spent for certain functions, but not others. Traceability on that from a project accounting perspective is important in nonprofit organizations. And you may find that you have a core ERP that handles basic needs, and then some type of a bolt-on that helps with that project accounting side of things. So it really is, nonprofit organizations are on that list of ones that more frequently end up in a best of breed environment, because their needs are more unique than the general core software systems are accustomed to being able to handle. So
Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of overall thesis of this conversation is the ability to find out which software solution meets your business needs. Really, as we've been talking about kind of our example around the house analogy, right? Reaching out to that expert, that contractor, that advisor, even just to just have an informal conversation, because there's so many options in the marketplace. And then also, I'll just let you know on the nonprofit side, Adam did a video on our YouTube channel as well on nonprofit opportunities that we've worked with when it comes to software selection. So definitely go check that out. Software selection is something we have probably the most content around. It is really our wheelhouse, and our number one recommendation all the time is there's no cookie cutter template. There's no, and if someone hands you that, you should throw it back in their face, because there's no way to really address the needs of the organization without really understanding it. So, thank you so much, Adam, for joining us today.